Raise your hand if you're familiar with the November 2015 terror attack in France. On the night of November 13th, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris, killing and injuring citizens in the Stade de France, as well as cafes, restaurants, and music venues. But you already knew this, right? This isn't new information. On the other hand, while talking to family and friends in India, they informed me of multiple suicide bombings in Beirut, Lebanon, and Baghdad, Iraq, that occurred just hours before the attacks in Paris. How many of you are as familiar with these attacks as you are with the ones in Paris? I asked this question to a group of 208 people. These are the results. What causes this phenomenon? Why are only 4.5% of my respondents equally knowledgeable about all of the attacks? Combining Beirut and Baghdad, there were 255 serious injuries and 60 deaths. In fact, only 6% of the respondents could even correctly name Beirut and Baghdad as places of attacks that day. I expected to wake up the next morning, November 14th, and see a headline something like this: "Mass killings in France and the Middle East leave hundreds dead and injured," or "ISIL claims responsibility for multiple attacks overnight." In reality, I woke up on that dark November morning and turned on the TV to see this: "Terrorist attack in France kills over 100. Paris declares state of emergency." For weeks, I couldn't pinpoint why I felt a deep sense of shock and dread every time I saw an article, grieving Facebook post, or news clip about the events in Paris. Finally, I realized that my inner turmoil was not a sympathetic reaction to the victims in Paris, but an angry response on behalf of the hundreds of victims ignored by our Western media simply for being too foreign. I soon realized that this is not an unusual phenomenon. Dozens of attacks in Africa, the Middle East, and other developing nations are swept under the rug to make way for whiter and more newsworthy events on Western countries. Fueled with a passion to discover why this bias exists, I decided to start my search with a focus on racial inequality within the media institutions themselves. Today, 90% of American media is controlled by 6 companies. These companies are CBS, Comcast, News Corp, Viacom, Time Warner, and Disney. These men are the CEOs of these companies. They all have one glaring similarity: their race. These 6 white elites have a major hand in what news is seen by the American public. So it's not surprising that most of the media that we are exposed to is white-dominated and glosses over minority-related events. This isn't just a problem in media ownership. In 2014, The Atlantic magazine found that minorities are drastically underrepresented in the journalism industry as well. On average, whites make up around 82% of journalism, while all non-whites combine to form only 18%. For an industry that claims to serve diverse news to an increasingly diverse public, it's extremely problematic that most major newsrooms are dominated by one race, the white race. Even worse, the few channels that do offer more diverse news are attacked and oppressed by the American media. For example, Al Jazeera America was a Qatar-funded channel that aimed to share Arabic news and current affairs with the American people. The channel came to the attention of Western countries during September 2001, airing videos and showing articles about the Taliban and other radical groups to inform and educate the American public on events going on in the Middle East. But because Al Jazeera was exclusively focused on Arab-related news, American media executives demonized the network. Leaders like Hillary Clinton entered the argument, saying that Al Jazeera was real news and not supportive of terrorism, But cable news executives shared personal concerns over the channel being broadcasted, such as a fear that their viewers would see violence. In the end, Al Jazeera disappeared from the American media at the behest of white executives who were afraid that the network was too Arab-based. The irony is apparent. Although American media is almost solely constructed of whites, American executives criticize and exclude non-white media for the sole purpose of being too focused on one race. This injustice, which leads to the erasure of minority news from mainstream media, lays the groundwork for inherent racism. As The Atlantic's Riva Gold says, news organizations are losing their ability to empower, represent, and report on minority populations in the world. In a survey I recently conducted, around 90% of the respondents claimed to receive their news on terrorism only from the media. And a lot of these respondents indicated that they watch television news on a regular basis. When terrorist attacks occur in Western countries, television news networks stand to attention. For example, as soon as television news networks caught wind of the attack in Brussels, Belgium earlier this year, they immediately made the attack the main story on all channels. CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, and other channels all canceled their regular showings of sitcoms and news magazines to begin showing live updates from reporters who were flown halfway across the world to the scene of the attacks. Shows like Today, 2020, and Dateline are also changed to live updates and information. During the Paris attacks, television news went even farther, reviewing their program lineup and taking out any shows that seemed too violent or hit too close to home for the events that had occurred. In summary, television networks do whatever they can to promote awareness and spread coverage about these attacks, taking every possible measure that they can to show sympathy and sensitivity to the victims. In contrast, other terrorist attacks are met with far less and even non-existent coverage. At least 72 were killed and 342 seriously injured in Pakistan because of a suicide bombing at a children's playground on Easter. Although this attack happened a full 5 days after the attack in Brussels, and it was far more severe in terms of injuries and death, it received relatively no coverage. American television networks continued to cover the events going on in Brussels, while the events in Pakistan were not even mentioned. This bias can also be seen in the online and print newspaper industry. Sean Darling-Hammond, a journalist from The Nation, collected data about the amount of online articles written about the Paris, Beirut, and Baghdad attacks. The results are shocking. There are 20 times more articles written about the Paris attacks than the Beirut attacks, and 55 times more articles written about the Paris attacks than the ones in Baghdad. The data also showed that this isn't unusual. On average, there is a severe gap in the coverage of Western and non-Western events. The January 7th Charlie Hebdo attacks occurred on the same day as a bomb blast in Yemen. And although 3 times more people died in the attack in Yemen, there were over 22,000 newspaper articles written about the Charlie Hebdo attack. And about Yemen, 565. In reality, a terrorist attack in the West does not even have to result in any loss of life or serious injury to receive more coverage than an attack outside of it. Last August, an attack in France prompted 10 times more articles than the attack in Yemen, but there were no serious injuries or deaths. A December attack in London prompted 5 times more articles than the amount in Yemen, but again, no serious injuries or deaths. In addition, The rhetoric of newspaper articles can often affect how a reader digests this information. In articles about Western events, emotional phrases and care are put into describing the events in great detail. In articles about events outside of the West, there is a cold and detached tone throughout the article, merely listing bare facts and statistics about what happened. This difference in the way that the articles are presented leads people to unconsciously become more supportive and sympathetic toward events in the West, as evidenced by these survey results. Social media is the most recent institution to be infiltrated by this bias, specifically Facebook. When the Paris attacks happened, Facebook installed a security check for the victims of people in Paris. This security check let victims and other people living in Paris and the surrounding areas connect with their loved ones and family across the world and assure them that they were safe and well. Despite this beneficial gesture by Facebook, there's a problem. There was no Facebook safety check for the people in Beirut, and there was no Facebook safety check for people in Baghdad. In doing so, Facebook is implying that it is more important to know about the safety of people in Paris than people in the Middle East. Additionally, Facebook also created a filter that users could cover their profile pictures with. Millions of people put their profile pictures up with a filter of the French flag colored filter, and they showed support and sympathy and compassion for the people in these countries. As we all logged onto our Facebook and scrolled through our feed, all of these people were shrouded with the Paris and French flag, and this increased the coverage for the victims in France. But the lack of security check or filter only increased the public's ignorance about the events going on outside of the world. So now, what effect does this bias have on us? The lack of coverage not only does a disservice to the victims in these countries, but it also fosters an uninformed American public. On April 2nd, 2015, an Al-Qaeda-related militant group called Al-Shabaab stormed Kenya's Garissa University. In a siege of nearly 15 hours, 148 students were killed. Over 700 were taken hostage, and 80 were seriously injured. In my survey, I asked people to record their knowledge of this attack on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being completely unknowledgeable about the attack, and 5 being knowledgeable enough to have a detailed conversation. 75% of the respondents put themselves in the 1 and 2 range. Only 2 people out of 208 chose 5. Because events like these are not covered, the public remains unaware of them and completely uninformed about events going on and the victims that are affected. When we miss out on key events that shape foreign policy and the prosperity of countries, we are rendered truly incapacitated. Furthermore, it creates a complete sense of apathy in our public concerning the victims in these countries. Unintentional or intentional, the media bias has the same effect. Because of it, we are a group of people who cannot even hold a conversation about a terrorist attack that occurred in a country outside of the West. It takes a great movement of people to spread awareness and to show the plight of these people who are forgotten and ignored by our media. As citizens of the world, we need to stand up and we need to show media networks that we care about these countries and we want them to report them to us and we want them to share what happens in them. I've created an online petition at this link to spread awareness about this important issue and to force our media networks to respond. Every signature on this petition brings us 1 step closer to being provided with essential information, and I encourage all of you to take out your phones and help our cause. Additionally, I ask that you guys all try to find as much information as you can on other types of media networks. Look at areas outside of the USA, such as Britain and Asia and the Middle East, because the more news that we look at, the more unbiased that it will be. Last year, Nigeria suffered from 40 major terrorist attacks. Raise your hand if you know about 5 of them. Raise your hand if you know about 3 of them. Raise your hand if you know about 1 of them. The fact that it is this few is unacceptable. Stand up. Make a difference. The only way that our Western world is going to be able to see its place in the global community is if we force our networks to provide us with the information that we deserve and to cover the events of all people, regardless of where they came from. Just because the American media ignores the lives of thousands of people doesn't mean that we should. Thank you.